It had been 7 additional days since Joey had been called back to the captain's quarters. 7 days, a full week, and at that time, he staggers out of the doorway. As he does, he leans up against the side of the bulkhead as he walks, looking like a POW that spent time in a concentration camp. He looked very ragged. Slowly moving his way down the corridor, leaning against the side walls, he was leaving a trail of blood on the side of the wall as he walked. He paused for a moment to check inside the captain's quarters, and of course, everything was beyond messed up. And he meant everything. The computer screen was completely cracked in several locations. The chair that the captain had used, which was designed for her own physiology, was broken in several different areas and now a heap of mess on the floor. The items all over the shelves had been knocked off and tossed around, some of them broken into many, many small pieces. Inside the small bathroom, you could see that everything was on the floor. Every single type of cleanser was all over the place, and the shower door was actually broken halfway off its hinges. The bed, which was originally shaped like a nest, was still sort of shaped that way, but now ripped into very small pieces and simply laid about. Now it truly did look like a nest. Inside that was the captain. Her body basically merged into the material as she slept, with the warming blanket, the only item not damaged, laid out across her. This time the blanket was across her body, yet you could still see the tip of her tail flicking out the side as she slept. She did look as though she was completely relieved on her face as she slept, though. Joey continued to leave, and still had a trail of blood leaving down the hallways. If anyone had gone through, they would have thought that they had some sort of massacre on board as the streams went across. Not very large, but definitely enough for someone to see. He walked his way to the infirmary and gets inside. He looks around for Doc, but doesn't see her anywhere. Then he looked on the clock. It was 0234, ship time. Great, everybody's asleep. Without hesitation, he balls up his hand, swings his hand to the side without even looking, and striking the large red button. This is the emergency call for Doc. It doesn't set off an alarm throughout the entire ship, but it does make a big racket inside the Doc's quarters. He could hear this, as she was living right next to the infirmary, and she immediately heard this, got up, and rushed in. She looked, and she could see Joey laying face down on one of the cots, and he was not moving. Immediately, she ran over, hooked up a bunch of drips, patched wounds, and scanned for injuries as she performs an assessment all at the same time, every single one of her appendages moving with incredible speed across the infirmary. The XO, who was on duty, heard this as well and ran in. She sees Doc and asks what's wrong, and Doc, just without looking, yells for her to hand over a device that was there. Her tentacles outstretched, but missing it by about a foot. The tool was then handed over into her tentacle, which immediately was pulled over to where Joey was. He was being tended to. It seemed as though every part of him was scratched up in some way, shape, or form, and the fresh wounds across his back seemed to be particularly deep. Once they took care of that, they rolled him over and then continued to treat him. They both paused for just a moment when they did roll him over to see what he looked like. Though they did examine him for their own personal reasons, they were both amazed at how sickly he looked, how terrible he looked compared to what he normally did. They immediately began to administer 2 more drips as Joey slowly began to reach for consciousness. With that, they looked, and as he was starting to come to, the color began to come back to his skin. Joey was finally able to wake all the way up, looked around trying to figure out where he was. Doc told him to wait and not to sit up, but of course, since when does a human actually listen? The Doc was using not only her standard appendages, but also her tentacles to try and hold Joey down so he didn't move too much. She also was continuing to check for injury, yet her tentacles seemed to be almost caressing his body. Joey was able to stand up, thank her, and asked her for some clothes as he wasn't actually wearing any. Doc had to remind him that clothing was not exactly needed. With this, he looked at her strangely and thought she was being sassy. And then she reminded him that only about 9% of the species anywhere actually wear clothes on a regular basis. Thinking for a moment, he realized that about 80% of the crew was usually bare-assed the entire time. He had just got used to it and didn't even think about it anymore. Then, thinking for a moment, he realized it's still the middle of the night, so screw it, and simply walked out. He thanked Doc again and then left. The XO came back into the infirmary. She had gone to check on the captain, and she came back carrying Joey's coveralls. Doc asked, "How's the captain feeling?" The XO grinned a little bit in her way. "Still asleep. For now, how she's doing, I'm pretty sure she's going to be that way." She then handed over the coveralls to Doc in a way to show that everything was going to be fine. The Doc, being an aquatic species, couldn't exactly smell the way most everyone could. So she simply took the garment and rubbed it across a sensory organ. With that, her eyes got wide and seemed to turn upwards, and her tentacles all just dropped onto the ground. While she seemed to be in her own world, the XO reached over and took the coveralls back. Seeing that the Doc was still in a daze, she simply said, "Guess I will have to be in command for a few days." The Doc simply came back to herself, pointed at the coveralls, and said, "And that? This? This might just find its way into the recreation area." They both then share a snarky laugh as the XO leaves. Joey was able to make it back to his room without further incident, and then he staggered inside. Walking towards his bed, he accidentally kicked the bottle that he had drank with his foot. He reached down, picked it up, looked at it. A bottle with no label and just one solid color. He sighs to himself, "Ugh," and then tosses it into the receptacle. He opens his locker and pulls out a small package. Unwrapping it, shows a strange, colorful, almost fruity-looking food bar. He then begins to chew on it, and the look on his face is that of pure disgust, but he still chokes it down. Behind that, he drank a lot of water, so much so that the actual system started to buzz at him that he was having too much. He then, using a little bit of water that was left, brushed his teeth, scraping a lot of his tongue trying to get the taste off, and then immediately went over to his bed. Still so exhausted, he just fell onto the mattress, and he was out like a light, without even turning off the lights. The next day, Joey walks out looking refreshed completely. As he walks out of his quarters, he goes into the galley and gets something to eat, but he has to deal with all the comments and giggles from all the rest of the crew that's around. Many of them even go so far as to point and gesture his way, gesturing up and down his body and things of that nature. After breakfast, he goes straight to the bridge, and as he enters, the place goes completely silent. He doesn't seem to let this notice, even though it was driving him crazy. He simply walks up and activates the holodisplay. Anything that didn't come to his datapad would be here. He was looking to see if there was anything that needed repaired, anything that would stick him inside the engine room for a few hours, anything, and no repairs needed. Apparently, he did his job a little too well. He began to look around for the captain to verify that this was the case, but he didn't see her. All he saw was the XO walking over. He asked, "Where's the captain?" "Still asleep. I'm in charge until she gets back." "So, does anything else need fixed? I mean, I'm free right now." At this point, the XO is on full display. Even though Joey doesn't quite understand what's going on, mainly because he's not paying attention, everyone on the bridge can see. Her amphibious form is spreading her arms up and away from her torso. She doesn't wear much clothing at all, and today she was almost completely naked. She believed this would be enough to get him towards her and probably take her right there on the bridge, as by human standards, she has curves in all the correct places. The form is also very human, except for, of course, the reddish color and the fact that certain areas are a little more girthy than they would be on a standard human. She then began to lean forward to accentuate her upper body, showing the different lumps that she might have in a way to entice Joey. Joey then again asks about repairs, and the XO gets annoyed and reminds him that with the captain out, she is in charge, and now he must be available to the rest of the crew. Joey puts his notebook away slowly, looks up to the XO's eyes. Need I remind you that it is not a great idea for the captain and XO to be out of commission at the same time? The XO thinks for a moment and needs to contemplate. Within a few seconds, the helmswoman jumps up and goes, "Then I'll do it," almost jumping out her seat saying this. Joey responds, "You're on duty." Turning back to the XO, he states, "This is the type of situation I was trying to avoid. To have a functioning crew, they need to be under administrative, selective, just be smart about this whole situation. That's why I left it up to the captain and the captain alone to choose who and when." The staff recoils from this realization, and many of them simply slump down. Joey, realizing that there's no reason for him to be in the bridge anymore, turns to leave. As he gets halfway across the bridge, the door opens, and another avian female jumps out of her station. "I've just been relieved." She hurries over to Joey. "I'll take my turn now," and starts to pull on him hard. Joey pauses for a second, turns his head slightly, and goes, "Boss?" The XO begrudgingly says, "Fine." They both then leave, this Harpy style of alien leading the way. As they get closer and closer to her quarters, Joey can notice that she is shuffling her feathers in anticipation, a nervous tick that every avian species does. Joey, being a bit concerned about this, had to ask her if she was in a mating cycle as well, and breathed a very heavy sigh of relief when she told him no. Entering the room, the Harpy pretty much yanked him right inside, almost violently. So much so that he almost dropped his own tools on his foot as he was trying to keep his balance. "What's your hurry? We got all night." The Harpy heard this, and as though the words didn't quite process, she paused, and then looked at him, almost frightened. Joey asked, "What?" The Harpy, "That's not possible. I thought all males only mounted for a minute." Joey then realizes this Harpy is young, probably only dealt with her own kind. "Oh, maybe for your species, but..." He then places his tools in the corner and turns to her, and he starts removing his coveralls, while the Harpy removed her, well, basically it looks like a harness what she was wearing. One could be confused, think it was a type of fancy fun time gear that somebody might want to use a whip with. They then stopped when they were done and simply looked at each other. The Harpy was beginning to get a little self-conscious, and she began to wrap those bright blue wings around herself, covering herself more as he approaches. Joey stopped before he even touched her. "Where's all that confidence from earlier?" The Harpy responded, "I'm now just a bit scared." She said this while looking at Joey, and his muscles were clearly well defined, as he had done most of the manual labor around here. To her, he looked strong enough to literally snap her in half, both cross and vertically. Joey simply looked at her and saw the fear in her eyes and said, "If you don't want to do this, I can just leave. There's no hard feelings." The Harpy pauses and thinks about it, thinks it's almost a bluff, like he's trying to play a game. That is, until Joey turns around and picks up his coveralls, looking for a way to put his leg inside. With that, The Harpy realized he wasn't joking. He would leave. He would be honorable. He would leave her alone if she was not comfortable with this. Yet now she was in control, and immediately she jumped up, waving her wings to get some vertical air, then grabbed Joey by the shoulder and his arms with her talons, not strong enough that she could actually rip into his flesh, but strong enough where he's not going anywhere. And then, with the force of her wings, pulled him back away from the door. 18 hours later, he leaves her room, taking a mental image of the very young Harpy still passed out on her bed. Joey chuckles at this, as her species do not sleep on beds, but instead sleep on that perch that is now in pieces in the corner. This one was so exhausted at this point that she was sleeping on a bed for once, a blanket covering her neck down to her navel. Well, if you can call it a blanket, the only thing he could find was a towel. He was worried that she might be cold, but let it slide as her face gave away her current feeling. Dressed back in his coveralls and with his tools in hand, he headed to see if there was any repairs, so he went to the bridge. He didn't trust his datapad anymore. After triple checking the display, his notes, and everything else to make sure no repairs were needed, Joey ended up going straight to the galley. He needed a recharge, something bad. Looking forward to sleep as he was eating, he decided he would make sure that he ate as much nutritious food as he could get his grubby mitts on. While eating, he was looking forward to a good, long sleep after all the exercise he had just gotten beforehand. Yet on his way back to his quarters, he heard something. Something was coming up behind him. Something was coming up behind him fast. His nerve kicks in, and he spins around, and what he sees is a bovine-ish humanoid running down the hallway towards him. Her species looks nearly hairless, if you want to call that, completely anthropomorphized, but almost as like a standing calf. At 5'9", she was surprising. Mostly human features, but clearly she had some bovine-ish features that could not be ignored. He was surprised seeing this, thought she was in a hurry, and started to step off to the side, but as he did, she ran up and grabbed him right around the torso, and before he could say anything, she lifted him up and just carried him away. Boy, she was a lot stronger than she looks, is all he thought. She carried him down the hallway, almost at a exceedingly fast, almost freakish pace. And she simply screamed as she ran down, "It's my turn!" Before he could protest, she seemed to stop, hit the door latch, and it opened up. Then he realized he was being tossed into a bed that seemed to be made of hay? What the hell? As he got back up and looked over, still holding on to his tools, he could see that with one hand she reached over and latched the door, made sure that it was locked, and with the other reached down and grabbed the only clothing she was wearing, which is a type of loincloth, and simply ripped it off and tossed it to the side. 16.5 hours later, Joey staggers into the infirmary. The doc sees this and rushes over to him because he looks like holy hell as he falls onto the floor. She got him on the table and immediately put several drips into his system. The examination, as she looked over, showed 2 broken ribs and additional damage. The doc was amazed that he was even still alive after this much damage. Then again, as she thought, humans do have a reputation. Once she put in a local anesthetic, which allowed Joey to stay still while she got the job done. She looked up at him, even while working, and said, "You can't keep this up." Even though there was sheer concern in her voice, Joey just seemed to smile. "Just patch me up and get me back out there, Doc." The doc was clearly upset, but still fixed his ribs, his cracked spleen, his torn ligaments, and gave at least 3 nutrient drips in each arm before he was even done. Once they were finished, Joey basically jumps off the table and walks over to get his coveralls that were currently hanging on the other side of the room. He says on the way by the doc, "Thanks, Doc," and then slapped her on her, well, her ass hangs kind of low because her torso is quite long compared to humans. So he had to reach down a little bit as he smacked her. He figures that was it, but as he reached for his coveralls, a tentacle came out and around and grabbed him around his arms, stopping his forward momentum. From behind him, he could hear the doc say, "You need to stay and rest. Doctor's orders." Joey was a little confused at the tone, but then he turned around as the tentacles reached out and closed the door. Though there's no lock on the infirmary, it was clear that she had closed it in a way that made everybody know, don't enter unless there was an emergency. Her arms, her main arms that is, were already removing the doctor's covering, which looked surprisingly similar to what humans call a doctor's coat. As she did this, she walked over towards the spare bed as her tentacles continued to pull Joey closer and closer to her. Once she got him between her and the cot itself, she simply pushed him down as hard as she could, pushing him right down onto the cot, and then loomed over her, raising her arms up to show and accentuate her body, which again was quite feminine, even for someone of a different species. And being that she did have a lot of humanish features, definitely made it doable. She then looked at him and said, "Time to take your medicine." Joey simply responded, "That's my line."